Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today's video I'm going to do something a little different. You probably won't actually do this in real life, but the reason why I'm going to show you how to do this is if you kind of want to install Windows and Linux on the same exact computer without ruining your setup originally, just to make sure it actually does work and everything's configured properly before you actually do this in a live environment. This is actually beneficial. I ran into this problem actually before where I was having an issue installing Linux Mint on a Windows 10 secure boot setup. So I wanted to see if it was even possible, if there was any hiccups I'm going to receive or any kind of errors, so that when I actually do the real installation, any problems I come up with, or if I do have any problems, I'm able to solve them real quickly. So thankfully there's only a couple small hiccups with the install. I will be able to show it to you later on in the video, but mainly it's kind of just a BIOS setup. So what you're going to have to do is, if you're going to do this in VMware Workstation or in real life, you can actually follow this video along and it will go ahead and explain it to you. The two systems I'm going to use today is Windows 10 Enterprise, but it'll work on any version of Windows 10. So you have Windows 10 Pro, Home, Educational, so on and so forth. The Linux distro I'm going to use today is actually Linux Mint. Again, it'll work with Ubuntu, Slacker, Arch, and so on and so forth. As long as they have secure boot or UEFI/EFI capabilities. Not every version of Linux has it, but the main ones you normally would use, basically anything that's off of a Ubuntu setup will have it. Ubuntu went ahead and actually created a EFI setup for all their installs, and a lot of companies are just taking that and incorporating that into their actual installers. For example, Linux Mint's one of them, where when you actually do boot, it doesn't boot saying Linux Mint or Mint, it actually boots saying Ubuntu grub loader, and then it moves on from there. So this video today is kind of just going to explain to you the simple process of how to do that. I will be speeding up the video a little bit during the installs, because mainly you know how to install Windows 10, and for the most people know how to install Linux Mint or any form of Linux. If you don't, I will do my best to slow down most of the stuff in there, but when it gets to the installation process, I'm more likely going to speed it up. Windows, I'm going to do pretty much a very quick install of it. I'm not going to install drivers or updates or anything like that. Even if you do the updates and the installs, you'll be fine. So yeah, this actually is done on my personal computer as well, the computer we're looking at right now. So I am in Windows. I will go ahead and minimize that. You can see here, you got my Windows desktop. There's my start screen. So it is in Windows. I did actually went ahead and install Linux Mint underneath it. So when it does boot, it actually boots to Mint. So we're going to go ahead and start the process. Now you will need a VMware Workstation. I will go ahead and link I will put a link in the description for where to download like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, as well as where to get a copy of Windows. Now you will need obviously a serial number for Windows to be activated. Linux does not require any serial numbers, so all you gotta do is just download it. Windows, you should make sure you have some form of serial or any kind of serial, whether it's for Pro, Home, Enterprise, and so on and so forth, if you plan on doing this in dual boot. If you're just testing it out to see if it works, you don't need a serial, obviously. You get a 30-day trial with all versions of Windows. After 30 days, it freaks out and starts telling you no, and then it shuts down every hour after that. So if you don't actually have any intention of really using this outside, just testing it to see if it does work on your computer. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to go ahead and create a new virtual machine. Now the way every Linux distro describes it, if you're going to dual boot, you should do Windows first, then Linux. You can go the other way around, but then installing the loaders is sometimes a little bit of a pain, because then you got to mix the grub loader with the Windows loader. It's easier to install the grub loader on top of Windows. Okay, so just a little bit of a reference for you. So we're going to go with typical install. I will install the operating system later, because I don't want to go through the quick install with all the questions that ask you if you actually pick the disk you want. So we're going to hit next. Now we're going to want to choose Microsoft Windows as the operating system, and the version will be version Windows 10 x64. This also does work with 7, 8. I think it does work with Vista. But again, then you're going to be turning off Secure Boot and everything. That kind of defeats the purpose. But if you're not going to use Secure Boot, technically you can do this with any version of Windows you want up to XP. So XP and above with no Secure Boot. But for this video, we are doing it with Secure Boot turned on. Because the majority of the computers today have Secure Boot built in and nobody wants to turn them off. And you should leave that extra layer of security on for malware intensive purposes and everything else. Okay, so Microsoft Windows, Windows 10 64, hit next. Now I'm going to label this dual boot. So I know, but you can call this whatever you want, lab, Windows, /Linux, so on and so forth. This is just a reference for myself. Now the disk size, we're going to have to double this. So we're going to do 120 gigs. So I'm going to dedicate 60 gigs to Windows 10 and 60 gigs to Linux. Again, you do not have to actually do it. You can put more in there. If you're doing this on a live computer, you want to kind of split your hard drive no matter what. Always get 50-50. If you're only testing Linux or seeing if you really like it or not, you can give it a little bit less and Windows more. Later on, you can actually delete Linux off your system very easily through the Linux actual disk setup. But for this video, we're just going to do 120 gigs. We're going to split it 60-60. We're going to leave it split virtual disks. It doesn't matter which one you pick because, again, it's only for testing. Hit next. And then we're going to hit finish. Okay, so now what we're going to do here is we have to do a little bit of editing for the virtual machine. So what we're going to do is click Edit Virtual Machine. First things first, give it more memory. 2 gigs is just not enough. 2 gigs is enough to run it, but you kind of want it to actually move along and be a little more real world. The lowest most people would have in their computer, even in 2019, 2020, is 4 gigs. If you can give it 8 gigs, that's awesome. If not, keep it at 4, and then go from there. Processor, I usually like to give myself, I have a quad core like most people do in 2019, so I like to give it at least all cores to access. If you only have a dual core, then you only select 2 for the numbers of core per processor. So there, you can leave everything else turned off here. So for CD, we're going to select our Windows 10 image. So use ISO image, hit browse. And I'm just going to go right into my ISO folder here. Windows 10, Windows 10 Enterprise. Okay. Networking, I like to keep it bridged because at least I know the internet's going to work 100%. If you're using VMware Player, I would suggest using bridged only because it just makes it simple for everything. You know the internet's going to work and kick on. But again, for demonstration purposes, we really don't need to know the internet's working because we're just trying to make sure that Secure Boot works with both Linux and Windows. Everything else you can leave as default. Okay. Now we go over to options. Now, as usual, under general, you got the list of the virtual machine name as well as the guest operating system setup, Microsoft Windows 10 64-bit. Then we're going to go down to the bottom here where it says advanced. Now, it's already selected here under firmware type, UEFI, but we're going to enable Secure Boot on it as well. Okay, now what this is going to end up doing is it's going to give it the actual replication, like if your system has Secure Boot, so it has the UEFI codes built into it and for you to be able to boot. Okay, now we're going to hit OK at the bottom. So we're all ready to go. And I'm just going to put my description here. Windows 10, LTSC, x64, and Linux Mint 19.1, and I'm going to enable Secure Boot enabled. Okay. So now we can go ahead and power on a virtual machine. Close that out. Now we're going to press any key. Going to maximize the screen here. Now again, for this part of the video, a lot of it I'm going to end up speeding up in a little bit, just to get through the basic installation of Windows 10. If you don't know how to install Windows 10, check out my other video for installation of Windows 10, and you'll be able to go through and do what I'm doing right now. Alright, so we're going to hit next, install now. Alright, I'm going to pick standard. Now you can see this is not a typical one. This has actually been built for updates and everything. So I have a choice of all three. Your installation screen could be different. You could have Home, Pro, Windows N, everything. So same type, hit standard. Alright, agree to the licensing terms. Alright, hit custom install. And then for here, we're going to format it. Now I'm only going to format for 60 gigs. Alright, once you format for 60 gigs, you're going to see technically 4 other partitions. Well, 5. So you got your recovery, your EFI, your MSR for the reserve for the virtual RAM, and then you got your partitioning here. Okay, this is where we're going to install on partition 4, which just says primary. And then this right here, the unallocated, will be used later for Linux install. So we're going to click primary, hit next. All right, and now we're going to go through the install. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm just going to speed up the system here. Actually, I'm probably just going to come back once it's all getting to the out-of-box experience, so we can just do that real quickly. So I'll go ahead, pause the video, and come back once it's all done. Okay, so now we just finished installing Windows. We are at the desktop at the moment. Now there's nothing else we have to do here. If you want to install VMware tools and stuff like that, you can, but we don't have to, because again, we're just showing the principle that it does work. But for me, I'm probably going to end up installing the tools on here, just so it looks a little more normal. And your screen or your desktop will probably look a little different than mine, depending on which version of Windows you are using. Do you need to install VMware tools? No. It's just for me because it takes away the borders on the side and everything over here. Also make sure that all the drivers compatible and everything, but as you can see here, the internet is working. The only thing that's not working properly right now is the display drivers. That's not a big issue. But if you've never seen how to install VMware tools, we're going to show you right now how to handle that. It only takes a couple minutes. All right, and that's it. So it's going to take the restart, which we're going to do anyway. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn off our virtual machine, and we're going to start the actual install of Linux. Again, it's your choice of Linux you want to use. Whatever one you want to use, though, make sure it is capable of doing UEFI/EFI installation. Verify it with the distributor. If it doesn't, then this video is not going to work out for you. If you choose to do something like Linux Mint, Fedora, Debian, Ubuntu, the big names in the Linux industry right now, I believe every one of them all does it. I've done this with Fedora, I've done this with Ubuntu and Linux Mint. Mint seems like it's the fastest out of the install, and that's why I chose Mint today. So we're going to start, shut down. I'm going to minimize this screen back to normal. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to double click on CD DVD, and now we're going to choose our Linux Mint installation CD, and I have it right here. Okay, now we're not going to boot directly into the system right away. We're actually going to go to the firmware. So what we're going to have to do is here is you see the play button up top, the little drop down arrow next to it. You're going to click that, and then at the bottom it says power on the firmware. And the reason we got to do it this way is because it doesn't give us the option to hit like F12 like you normally would in the computer, but we have to get to the BIOS to boot, because secure boot was only going to let us boot to the OS installed. It's not going to allow us to go to USB devices, CDs, or so on, unless we tell it to. Physically have to go in there and say boot to this device. So we're going to click power on to firmware. Alright, I'm just going to go ahead and maximize the screen again. Alright, so you'll be booted with this. Now, VMware has two different boot menus, obviously, one for BIOS and one for EFI, UEFI. As you can see, we're in the EFI installation section, or BIOS section. Now you can boot directly to the hard drive, CD-ROM, or we have a network that is capable of doing it. You can't move these anywhere like you normally can in, like, say, a BIOS screen where you can just F6 or up and down and move them. You actually can only select. So we're going to go down to VMware Virtual SATA CD-ROM, and we're going to hit enter. And then it's going to give you your Linux Mint setup. Now we have a couple options here. You have Linux Mint 19, the live CD, the compatibility section of it. So if you're having any problems with drivers or something, this is for live installs if you're having a problem with your initial. And then you have the OEM install. This is for manufacturer, this says, but it's also for you. The OEM install pretty much just skips the GUI and just goes right into installation. But if you're not familiar with that, your best bet is to pick the first one. So we're going to choose the first one. Okay, as you can see, it's going through its boot cycle. Now with Linux, every CD you get is an actual live CD, so you're able to test it out previously on a thumb drive or an actual, if you want to burn it to a CD or DVD, you can. And to test out if everything's working, it usually installs basic drivers. So if your networking works, your wireless works, and everything on the live CD, there's a very good chance it's going to work in the actual, installation section. If you have like graphics drivers like NVIDIA or AMD, they may work out of the box. Sometimes they don't. So if they don't work out of the box, it's okay. Once you get into Linux, you're able to install drivers and everything for it. NVIDIA, I know for a fact, has been working heavily on Linux drivers and producing a lot of different updates for it. So if you have an NVIDIA driver, chances are it's going to work out of box. AMD ATI video cards still will work. They may have a couple of glitches. You just have to kind of go to the manufacturer and just tell them what distro you're using, and they'll go ahead and fix it. As you can see here, the only thing that's not working on me is networking, and that's because we're in a virtual environment. If you were doing this in a live environment, there's a very good chance, at least with mine, my network card worked. My wireless and network card both worked. It also went full screen. As you can see, it's only going partially. Again, because there's no actual drivers being installed, because VMware requires specialized drivers. So first thing we're going to do here is we're just going to take a quick look at the disk setup. So we're going to go down here and type in the word disk and click on disks. Okay, so we have a 129 gig hard drive, which is what we put before. Our technically is 120, but they partitioned it a little bit bigger, like always. And you see all our 5 partitions we had. So you have your recovery partition, okay, the EFI system partition, the reserve partition for memory and programming for Microsoft, and the Windows partition. And then back here you see our free space that we have where we're going to be putting our Linux Mint on. Alright, so from here we're going to go ahead and do the install for Linux Mint. Now again, we are on secure boot still. We didn't change anything, so this is going to be exactly as you're going to see if you were doing a secure boot on your system. You could run into a couple of small errors, but that's usually a BIOS situation. Example, on my computer, I actually have to specify the UEFI boot section. So when I actually go to boot, I actually get an error saying that it can't find my partition because the way my BIOS is set up, I actually have to choose the Linux, EFI boot installation, and then it goes ahead and corrects the problem. On another laptop I've done it on before, it just installed with no questions asked, worked fine, and was able to figure it out. So check your manufacturer as well. If you do get an error, chances are it's more than likely that. Also, I'll put a link down below too explaining from Linux Mint on how to fix an EFI boot manager problem if it doesn't actually boot to Linux. Again, there are some rare cases it does happen. I'm going to try my best to replicate any kind of errors to fix it, but if I can't, at that point, we're just going to have to go through community forums and so on. But for majority of the people out there, the way I'm showing you right now, it will work. Like I said, mostly worked with everybody else. So this is the actual one of the errors you're going to receive. So because Secure Boot's turned on and you want to install third-party software, you have to turn off Secure Boot, which is kind of defeating the whole purpose. Okay? So we don't want to do that. We can install the third-party software, graphics, hardware, and everything like that once Linux installed. So don't be worried that, oh, it's not going to install my drivers and everything. It will once we install Linux. This is just saying if you want to do it before you actually get to the user system, you can. I always skip this. So hit continue. It also tries to install it as a BIOS and not a secure boot setup, and that's where we have to do this next step. So we have Windows boot on there. It does recognize we have a Windows boot on the system. For normal cases, if you weren't using EFI, UEFI, you would pick the install next to Windows. So if you're installing a Windows 7, a Vista, an XP without secure boot, or even 10 or 8 without a secure boot, the first option is the one you want to go with. It's the easiest, it knows how to configure everything. But we're doing with secure boot. So we're going to have to do a little more modifications to this. So down below we're going to click on something else and then hit continue. Alright, so now this screen is going to show us all the partitions and everything that we have on our drive. So you can see here, these are all our partitions. There are a couple extra obviously for this one. Just don't worry about that obviously. Alright, so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to tell the computer where the bootloader is coming from to begin with. So down below here it says device for bootloader installation. Normally you just put it directly on the hard drive, but because it's a secure boot, it won't know how to read that. So we're going to have to drop this menu down and select the Windows Boot Manager. Now your SDA location may be different than mine. If you're doing the virtual machine, obviously to test it, it should be the same, but if it's not, all you got to do is just look for the Windows Boot Manager. You will only have one. I've never seen it have more than one before. Okay, so now once we did that, we're now going to have to create 2 new partitions. Alright, partition number 1, so we're going to click on the free space here, and we're going to hit the plus sign. Now we're going to create the swap drive first. Okay, swap drive just allows, memory to get, it's pretty much virtual memory for Linux. It allows information to go back and forth. The recommended is always 2 gigs or 200 megabytes, but I've done up to 12 gigs. What it mainly does is that it matches your memory. So some people like to make it, if you got say 12 gigs, 8 gigs, you just want to pretty much match the amount of memory you have in there. But for the most part, I've always left it at 2 gigs and never had a problem with swapping memory. If you do want to change it later, you can. It's actually very simple to do. So for this video, we're going to leave it at the default for 200 megabytes or 2 gigs. Okay, we're going to leave it as a primary, and we're going to put it at the beginning of this space. And we're going to we're going to go all the way down to swap area. Okay. So we're going to wait a couple seconds. It should go ahead and create a new swap partition. So as you can see here, swap is all done. And now for the last bit, we got to create the actual partition. So we're going to click on free space again and hit the plus sign and leave it as your default size. Use as ext4 journal. So we're going to pretty much leave everything here as default. And then the mount point, we're going to make this root. Backslash always means root in Linux, in case you don't know that. You don't want to change to boot or home or anything like that. You just kind of want to leave it as this. Now, I've seen some people do 2 different things where they had a separate partition for their home drive. So they take this 60 gigs here we have, they would split it in half to 30 and say 30 gigs would be for root and then the other 30 gigs would be for your home directory. You can do that if you want to. I've never done that before. I just don't find a point for it. Everything's going to be on the same drive anyway, so having 2 partitions, to me, I don't have a purpose. But if you know of a reason why you do it, put it in the comments below and tell me why you prefer to have your root and your home directory separate. So as we can see here, we have our swap drive, and then we have our partition drive for our root and for our Linux distro. So now everything's still good. Make sure again the device for bootloader is Windows Boot Manager. If it's anything else, make sure it is that. If it's anything else, the installation is not going to work and you're just going to have a ton of errors. And pretty much have to reinstall Linux from scratch again. So we're going to click on install now. This is the confirmation. So as long as you followed what I told you to do and you're pretty much fully aware of what's going on here, make sure that these are correct. If these are not correct or these are anything different than what you set up, which usually doesn't happen, but if it is, go back, correct it, and then we're good to go. This works exactly the same way as it was in a live environment. You'll be presented with your main hard drive exactly as you see here. So you have your 1. You'll just pick the sizing you want. So hit continue. And then from here, we're just going to go ahead and run through the basic install. So I'm going to pick the location. I'm going to name my computer. Actually, we're going to call it Duel Linux. Username. Okay, so everything's all here. Now you can do one of 2 things. You can log in automatically. So it's automatically going to put the password in, and this will be the default login every time. Require my password to log in, and encrypt my home folder. Now for most people, for security purposes, I recommend encrypting your home folder. But if you do log in automatically, you cannot encrypt your drive, because it kind of defeats the purpose. If you're just going to let them log in automatically, well then they have every right to steal your data then. So for this, I will do require password to log in, and I will encrypt my home drive as well. Okay, now what this is actually going to do is just going to go ahead and install Linux. So I am going to, again, like I did with the Windows, I'm going to pause the video, come back when it tells me I have to reboot, and then we will go from there to show you what happens when everything's successful. Hopefully. I mean, I'm hoping everything will be successful in the end. We're going to find out. I've done this a few times already, and every time it's been successful, so, you know, cross your fingers, everything's good. But, yeah, once it's all done, I will come back and we'll show you what happens once you're all ready to go and reboot Linux. Okay, so now the installation is complete. You have two options here to restart or continue testing. Well, we don't need to continue testing because we just want to see if it actually works. So we're going to hit the Restart Now button. All right. Then it asks you to remove the media. So we're going up to here to VM, remove devices, and we just want to make sure that it says there's no checkbox next to CD. So that means that the virtual machine has already disconnected the CD. So if it all works, we're going to hit Enter. And there we go. So if everything worked out perfectly, you should be greeted with the Linux Mint installation or the grub loader. Okay, you have a few options again. You have the Linux Mint. Advanced options for Linux Mint is more or less like a recovery CD or a recovery partition that assists you with any problems. Your Windows Boot Manager to get back into Windows. And System Setup brings you right to the BIOS. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to boot back into Linux to make sure it's working, obviously. And then I'm going to go ahead and reboot it again and boot into Windows just to show you that that's working as well. Now I am doing this on only 4 gigs of RAM, so load times, boot times, everything else will vary between system to system. But if everything does work, we'll be going ahead to seeing the desktop for Linux Mint in a few seconds. Well, the login screen at least. Now again, with Linux Mint, it's going to look again like it did before, where it's a smaller screen, not all the drivers are installed. If you're going to do this in the virtual environment, you got to install, again, VMware tools for Linux. I'm not going to do that for this one, only because it's a little more convoluted to install for this. And again, it's just for testing purposes, so it's not worth it. So as you can see here up top, it says Dual Boot Linux, which is what we called it. It has my name. I'll go ahead and type my password to log in. And there we go. We agree with the welcome screen. The first steps that you need to take to go and handle it, as you can see down here, I actually do have internet. So it does pick up my network cable without actually installing VMware tools. Now, just to show purposes, if I actually do want to install VMware tools, they don't work properly when you want to do a dual boot setup. And I'll show you exactly what's going to happen. So say you do want to install VMware tools. The tools you see right here are actually Windows. What VMware does is actually reads the original partitioning and the EFI. Now, because it knows that Linux doesn't technically run EFI, well, natively at least at the moment, you have to do special work to it. It automatically assumes this is a Windows. So everything you see right here is actually a Windows installation. See? This is not actually going to help you in any way, shape, or form if you actually want to install VMware tools on this to get it to work. Quickly, what I can do is I can tell you that you just have to look for the ISO file. So removable devices, under settings. So we're going to go here to CD DVD, use ISO image, and we're going to click browse. And what you're going to have to do is you actually have to go to your program file, VMware, VMware Workstation. And as you can see here, it lists all the different styles of tools we can use. So you have your Windows, your pre-2000s, your Vistas. We're just going to click on Linux and hit OK. You will be told that it's already using the CD. We're going to go ahead and disconnect it and override the lock so that we're able to actually mount the new VMware tools. As it still has a hiccup. So cancel installation. Okay. So remove devices. Then make sure it says CD DVD is actually connected. Okay. Now as you can see, it's a different icon now. This is the actual Linux icon. And here's your VMware tools. And then this is what you're going to want to install. So what I like to do is I always like to take it, put it on the desktop, wait for it to finish copying over, close out, and then you have to install it from here. So the easiest way of doing it is opening up a terminal. In the actual folder, as you saw me do, I'm going to stretch this out. Now I'm not going to actually install it. I'm just going to kind of give you the script on how to quickly install if you want to. So you're just going to go ahead and type that in, hit enter, and then you're just pretty much going to click enter the entire way down to install defaults. If you don't want to install defaults, you want to do a little anything else, well, that means you're probably a more advanced user, and I don't have to show you how to do this because you probably already know how to do this. But for a person who's never done this before, this is how you're going to have to do it. If you want, watch my installation video on how to install Linux Mint and Ubuntu. I go through the installation process of how to install VMware tools on both of them. Again, it's just pretty much from this point hitting enter all the way down until it's done, reboot, and then you'll get full screen nativity for your desktop. Networking is going to work, Wi-Fi is going to work, your USB support is going to work, printer, the whole 9 yards. So I'm just going to close out of this. But yes, so here's your VM. Now, like I said, we're going to go ahead and reboot, and we're going to boot into Windows to prove that it's going to work as well. So from here, I'm going to go down to Windows Boot Manager. So far, looking pretty good. And there we go. So as you can see here, we successfully installed Windows 10 and Linux Mint 19 in UEFI EFI with Secure Boot installed. Okay, now also too, we go to Start here. We can go to, because I forgot where I'm at, File Explorer. And as you can see here, when you click on PC, you have only 60 gigs, as we made that. You are not able to actually see your Linux OS in here. You can install special software that can actually allow you to see Linux. Also, if you install the subsystem for Linux, you're able to actually see your Linux partition and go through it and do what you want to do. The other way around, though, if you're in Linux, you're able to see all your Windows. So if you have multiple hard drives, NTF drives, you're able to log into your local disk and see all your files and move things around. It's got a lot more power to it if you're on the Linux side than on the Windows side. But yeah, that's everything here. So we'll go ahead, shrink this down a little bit, but there you go. That's exactly how you can install Windows and Linux Mint on the same partition, on the same hard drive using dual boot. This method, like I said, does work in both. This is the exact same method I did on my actual personal computer. I installed Windows first, this exact version of Windows Enterprise, and the same version of Linux that you saw with Secure Boot on my computer. Again, I did run into an error on mine, mainly because my BIOS doesn't allow unsigned EFI code. So I had to go in there and actually tell it that it's an okay system to actually boot to. Once I did that in the BIOS, it went ahead and let me boot into the system. So from there, I will leave a description. I'll leave a description down below explaining my situation on how I got it to work. So if you had the same problem yourself in your BIOS, you can probably go through there. Down in the description below, you'll also be given the link for the Windows Media Tool to create a media tool, the link for Ubuntu for Linux Mint, as well as if you're going to create a USB drive of it, I will also leave Rufus down there, which is a great tool to use to creating USB bootable devices as well. I believe it does DVD burns as well. I'm not sure. I haven't burned a DVD or a CD in years, so I wouldn't actually know if that does do a good job with it. But for USB, if you're just creating a quick USB, plug it in, it goes ahead and formats it, sets everything up, and creates it bootable for you. So you just plug it in, boot right to it. So yeah, hopefully this helps somebody out there. If not, it was a pretty interesting project I worked on. It did, like I said, help me out in the sense being that I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to get any kind of crazy errors or any problems with booting Windows and Linux using Secure Boot. As my Windows was already set up with Secure Boot, I didn't want to have to go ahead, uninstall it, then reinstall Windows under that and go there. So it was actually a really nice little test project I did to figure it out. So yeah, I hope this helps somebody else out there. Like, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check out my other videos. I do a lot of virtual bit videos as well. Right now I'm doing the Windows installation videos from 1, 2, 3, XP, 7, and so on and so forth. I've installed DOS on there. I have Linux installations on there for certain flavors of Linux if you have. As you can see over here, I am working on another project, Windows Whistler. This is actually pre-Windows XP. So this is actually the upgrade to Windows 2002 XP. So I'm actually going to go ahead and do an install for that and kind of let everybody see what Windows XP was formed before it became what it was. So yeah. Again, like, subscribe. If you have any questions or concerns or any problems, just leave a comment down below. And like always, everybody, you guys have a great day now. See ya.